All right, so let's do our unit flashcards for federalism. Quick reminder that this unit flashcard video doesn't go over every single thing we've talked about in class, but it's really just kind of a quick snapshot of big ideas, big topics, and it gives you a good direction to go in for your studying. So the first flashcard really kind of gets at the core of what federalism is, which is the idea that there's shared powers between the state and federal governments in our system, and that's a kind of a core constitutional principle. And so understanding that we have national powers, which are also known as enumerated or expressed powers. So there's a little terminology there that's important. If you see those phrases, know that they're talking about national powers. And then you have state powers, which you also call reserved powers. And the idea of reserved powers comes from the 10th Amendment, which states that powers not given to the federal government are reserved to the states. Concurrent powers are shared powers they have that they both can do certain things. So just a few examples, and I'm not going to go through them all, but you might want to refer back to your textbook because there's a chart on this. National powers, anything in Article 1, Section 8, we have as national powers. The power to declare war, the power to regulate interstate commerce, the power to establish a post office. There are the necessary and proper clause. There are key national powers that are listed. And then the state powers, anything that falls under regulating the health and welfare of the citizens would be considered a state or reserved power. States run the elections. That's actually in the Constitution, that states run their own elections. So, the states have important powers too. So police powers, running elections. And then the concurrent powers, a few examples of those, certainly the power to tax and spend. The power to establish courts is a concurrent power. They're both state court systems and federal court systems. So what are the different powers? Can you provide examples of each? Make sure you go back in your textbook or on that first video I gave for this unit when I kind of went over the different powers and find a Venn diagram that kind of has all three of those laid out so you can see it visually. Our second flashcard talks about grants and mandates. It says, what are these concepts and categorical grants, I should say, and block grants? What are these concepts and how do they impact the relationship between the state and federal government? So grants are when the federal government gives money to the states, right? That's a grant in money. But when a grant is categorical in nature, the spending of the money has specific requirements. So the federal government can give money for specific things for the state to spend on. So if it's money for education, it would be more specific. It would be about, either certain classroom materials or specifically for teachers or for transportation. The federal government says you get this money if you spend it on certain things. And so that enhances the power of the federal government because it tells the states what to do. The federal government have leverage over the states. Block grants, on the other hand, actually enhance the powers of the state governments because these are grants of money, but they don't have those strings attached, not nearly as many. So instead of saying specifically what in education the money needs to be spent on, they can just say, spend it on education. It's a block grant. You can spend it on what you want. And so people who are more conservative and more proponents of state powers, they'd be more in support of block grants, and people who may be more liberal would want more strings attached to that spending bill so the federal government have a little more authority. When we talk about mandates are when the federal government instructs or tells states what to do. They say you have to do these certain things. A good example would be the Americans with Disabilities Act, which says that states have to have certain requirements in place for housing and building codes to be handicap accessible, things of that nature, or states need to, or maybe even local governments, local municipalities need to have certain standards for water quality or emission standards or so on and so forth. So, mandates are when the federal government says, states, you need to do this, but sometimes they're not funded. Sometimes they can be very controversial when the states say your water needs to have this level of cleanliness. Your drinking water needs to meet these standards. We're not going to give you any additional money to do it. You just need to make it happen. So those are called unfunded mandates, and they can be controversial. And some people think it's when the federal government doesn't fund these mandates that they impose upon local governments that they're maybe overstretching their authority. Another concept here that we didn't really talk about in class, but it's worth mentioning, is the idea of federal aid programs or incentives. You certainly could have programs where the federal government just provides direct money or aid for certain things, whether it's to state governments to implement certain policies. We can even see examples of that with the COVID bill, the COVID relief bill in the springtime of 2020, where the federal government is giving huge amounts of money not only to individuals but also to local governments. And now there's this discussion about maybe we need to give more money to local governments, more federal aid programs to help people and to help governments plug in gaps in their in their budgets. And then there are incentives. If you do certain things, then you can be incentivized. An interesting example of that would be a federal program called the Race to the Top program, education initiative under the Obama administration, which they said, you'll get money for schools if you come up with interesting and dynamic initiatives for how to improve student performance. So states would submit applications about, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and then the federal government would give money for that. So that's an example of a federal incentive, in which the financial power of the federal government is being used to kind of tweak state behavior or state action. So that's kind of related to grants as well. If we're going to take a look at the constitutional concepts here, we take a look at the 10th Amendment. So how does the 10th Amendment impact the power of the state versus the national government? The 10th Amendment is a state, a part of the Constitution that gives power to the states. Okay, it says powers not given to the national government or prohibited to it by the Constitution are reserved to the state. So any power that the federal government doesn't have is inherently a state power, and that certainly is a broad expansion of federal power. So too is the 14th Amendment, which we'll talk about later on in the course much more specifically. But one of the big provisions of the 14th Amendment, the purpose of the 14th Amendment, was a post-Civil War bill. It was a Reconstruction bill, really. It was designed to prevent states from discrimination. And we'll talk about it in our unit on civil rights, but it basically says no state will take away people's due process rights or legal protections, and no state will take away equal protection of the law. And so those no state shall clauses are very important, and they really do enhance the power of the federal government to make sure that people's rights and liberties are protected, and does make sure states have some limits on what they can do. But in this back and forth discussion about clauses of the Constitution or parts of the Constitution, we also have the Commerce Clause, which is another clause that's in the Constitution that enhances federal government power. We did a whole lesson on how the Commerce Clause can be used to enhance the authority of the federal government. And so that's really, really important. So I would refer you back to our lesson on the Commerce Clause, which is on Canvas, which goes through some different scenarios and interesting case studies about the Commerce Clause. And then, in conjunction with that is the Necessary and Proper Clause. The Necessary and Proper Clause is in Article 1, Section 8, and it says that Congress can pass any laws that are necessary and proper to carrying out foregoing powers. And so if they can say it's connected to any of our powers in Article 1, then we can go ahead and exercise this authority. So in McCulloch versus Maryland, for example, we'll talk about it on a different flashcard, so I'll hold that thought. But they use both the Necessary Proper Clause and the Commerce Clause to justify the decision the Supreme Court makes. And they use the Supremacy Clause. It's Article 6 of the Constitution. It says the national government, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So if you're going to have this dispute between state and national governments, Supremacy Clause can come in as a relevant topic there. And then we have some other phrases, other parts of the Constitution that are relevant to our discussion of the balance of power. So the 16th Amendment is something that's passed during the Progressive era, and the 16th Amendment actually gives the federal government the authority to impose income taxes. So this is something that dramatically enhances the power of the federal government. So they had been able to tax, but they hadn't been able to directly tax income necessarily. There were some disputes over how they were permitted to do that, were they permitted to do it, and did they have to apportion it based on state population, and all of this was just clearly resolved with the 16th Amendment. The federal government can tax income. So that really enhances the power of the federal government. These two concepts here, ex post facto laws and bills of attainder, these are things that the government are not allowed to do. I haven't talked about these explicitly, so I'll mention them. An ex post facto law is a law that basically criminalizes behavior that occurred prior to the passage of the law. So if you pass a law that says something is illegal or something has been illegal for the past 10 years and we're going to punish people for it, that's just something that is in there to prevent both state and governments from taking away individual rights and individual freedoms. And a bill of attainder would be a law that finds someone guilty, a congressional act that finds someone guilty without a trial. And the Constitution clearly sets up a judicial branch, and they say, well, you need to have that's what courts are for. Congress can't just take a vote and determine that someone has committed some sort of crime. So those are limits on federal government power. I think I'll stop here and pick up with the rest of this in the next video.